You've probably imagined the Middle Ages as a world of knights, castles, and epic battles. But the truth? Most people never saw a castle. And their battles were with cold mornings, hard bread, and endless work in muddy fields. In this journey, we'll step quietly into the life of a 14th century villager, from the moment you wake up on a straw mattress, to the rules and duties that control every breath you take, to the rare moments when life breaks from its routine. And by the end, you might find yourself wondering, not just how long you'd survive there, but whether you'd even want to. Chapter 1. Waking up in the 14th century. Imagine its dawn in a small English village in the year 1352. You're lying not in a soft mattress, but on a straw-stuffed sack called a palliasse. The straw isn't fresh. It's been used for months, maybe years. It smells faintly of mildew, and you feel the occasional prickle where a stray thistle stem was never fully removed. Beneath the sack is a simple wooden frame, if you're lucky, or more likely, just the beaten earth. Floor, your pillow, if you can call it that, is a cloth sack stuffed with rags or more straw. Bed sheets, as we think of them today, are a luxury. You might have a wool blanket, thick and scratchy, its fibers occasionally stabbing into your skin. The blanket probably hasn't been washed in a long while. Soap is expensive, and water for. Washing requires effort-filling buckets from the well or river and heating it over the fire. The idea of freshly laundered anything is mostly for the wealthy. If you share your bed, and you probably do, it's with family members. Whole families often slept together for warmth. If you're in a peasant household, that means your siblings are pressed against you, and possibly your parents, depending on the season and the size of your home. Privacy, as a concept, barely exists. And yes, the occasional mouse or flea might make an appearance. The sound of the rooster crows, but so do the church bells. Bells mark time, because few people own clocks. Time itself is measured in terms of the church's schedule, matins, lauds, vespers. You have no wristwatch. You have the rhythm of labor, the seasons, and the church's call to guide you. You rise. But it's not as simple as putting on clean clothes. The tunic you wore yesterday is the tunic you wear today, and the next day, and probably for weeks. Your undergarments, if you have them, might be linen, and they might be washed more often than your outer clothing, but more often might mean once every few weeks. Clothes are valuable, often patched and repatched. Every stitch of fabric is handmade, so nothing is discarded lightly. The first task is fire. If it has gone out overnight, you must rekindle it from embers or strike flint against steel to start anew. Without fire, there's no cooking, no warmth, and no light beyond the dim gray that seeps in through the shutter cracks. In winter, this moment, getting the fire going, can be the most miserable part of the day. Your fingers ache from cold before they even wrap around the tinder. Breakfast is not bacon and eggs. It's more likely yesterday's bread, hardening to a point where you need to soak it in ale or broth to make it chewable. Ale is not a luxury. It's safer than water, which can be contaminated. The ale is weak, low in alcohol, more like a slightly sour grain tea. If you have a little cheese, that's a good morning. If you're poorer still, maybe you have a pottage, a watery stew of whatever grains and vegetables you have on hand, boiled in the same pot every day. Never entirely cleaned between uses, you step outside. Your home is a wattle and daub hut, wooden. Poles plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. The thatched roof above your head is thick with years of plant stalks, and in winter, it harbors insects and sometimes small birds. The floor inside is just packed earth, strewn with rushes that are replaced only a few times a year. Those rushes cut plants from nearby marshes, help soak up spills and smells, but after a while, they hold odors rather than mask them. The smell outside is different, but not fresher. Manure from animals, smoke from fires, and the general tang of unwashed humanity linger in the air. The village's waste disposal is as rudimentary as it sounds: chamber pots emptied into ditches or onto manure piles. In wet weather, the paths are mud mixed with less pleasant substances. You walk carefully, though your boots, if you have them, are made from thick leather that absorbs everything. If you're a farmer, today's work begins in the fields. Plowing, sowing, weeding, or harvesting, depending on the season. You work with tools of wood and iron, their handles worn smooth by generations of use. If you're lucky, you own your tools. If not, you use those belonging to your lord or borrow from a neighbor. The work is repetitive, physically exhausting, and entirely necessary. There are no weekends, no days off except for religious holidays, which are numerous but also involve compulsory attendance at church and community duties. If you're a craftsman, say, a blacksmith or a carpenter, you'll head to your workshop. Tools are precious, metals expensive. The pace of production is slow, and each item is valuable. There is no such thing as mass production. Each nail, each pot is handmade. The church looms in the center of your life, both physically and socially. It's the largest building in the village, made of stone when everything else is wood and mud. It's where you hear the news, such as it is. News travels slowly, sometimes weeks or months after the fact. A battle fought in a far-off region might only become known when a traveler passes through, or a priest mentions it in a sermon. And yet, despite this slowness, your life is busy from dawn to dusk. There's always something to be done: repairing the thatch, mending clothes, tending to animals, fetching water. The work is not optional. To stop is to risk hunger, cold, or illness. Food is always a concern. The harvest must last until the next harvest. A poor growing season can mean hunger by late winter when food stores run low. People survive on what they can preserve: salted meat, dried peas, hard cheese. Scurvy is a threat in these months, as fresh vegetables are scarce. Illness is constant. You might have tooth pain for months or years. Wounds risk infection without much in the way of effective treatment. The village healer might use herbs, but the understanding of medicine is limited. Death from small cuts or fevers is common. You know many people who have died young. It is not unusual. Life expectancy is low, not because everyone dies young, but because so many children do. If you reach adulthood, you might live into your 50s, but the risk is ever present. Your entire world is small, perhaps a few miles in every direction. The idea of travel is strange unless you're a peddler, a soldier, or a pilgrim. Most people are born, live, and die within sight of the same church steeple. And yet, in this limited space, everything you need to survive is contained: fields, flocks, workshops, and the all-important social bonds that keep the village functioning. As the day draws toward evening, you return to your hearth. Dinner might be more pottage, perhaps with a little meat if it's a feast day, or you've trapped a rabbit. You sit in the dim firelight, the smoke curling upward and escaping through a hole in the roof or a gap in the wall. The fire's warmth is a comfort, though the smoke stings your eyes. Before bed, you might hear stories from elders or prayers from the priest. The stories are not of far-off lands, but of saints, local legends, and moral lessons. The night is long and dark. Without lamps or electricity, you sleep when it's dark because there's little else to do. The fire dies down, the cold creeps in again, and you curl up under the scratchy blanket, listening to the faint sounds of the village settling into stillness. The routine is unchanging, the demands unending. But here, in this world of labor, faith, and small comforts, life has a rhythm as steady as the turning of the seasons. And yet, if you were suddenly placed here, in this exact moment, without modern clothes, without modern food, without the expectation of privacy or hygiene, how long would you last before the weight of the cold, the hunger, and the labor wore you down? Chapter 2. The Web of Duty and Survival. The medieval world was not simply a scattering of thatched cottages in a landscape of fields. It was a system dense, structured, and inescapable. Every day was shaped not only by the practical demands of survival, but by the legal and social obligations that defined who you were and what you could do. If you were a peasant in 14th century England, whether a freeman or a serf, your life was tied to the manor. The manor wasn't just the lord's house. It was an entire estate, with the lord's domain land at its center and the village clustered nearby. The lord provided protection and the right to work certain plots, but in return, you owed him labor, goods, or rent. For the serf, this meant week work days of labor on the lord's fields. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday might be spent plowing, weeding, or harvesting grain that you would never eat. The rest of the week you worked. Your own strip of land to feed your family. You couldn't simply leave the manor. You were legally bound to it. To run away was not just disobedience, it was theft of your labor. Freemen had more flexibility. They paid rent in coin or kind and could often come and go as they pleased, though travel still carried risks. Even they, however, were woven into the web of obligations, tithes to the church, participation in village maintenance, and adherence to manorial court rulings. The manorial court was the heart of local governance. Held a few times a year, it was where disputes were settled, fines levied, and customs reaffirmed. Attendance wasn't optional. If your cow strayed into a neighbor's field, you were fined. If you failed to repair your section of the boundary hedge, you were fined. If you brewed ale without the Lord's permission, or sold it at the wrong price, you were fined. The fines were not crippling in a single instance, but they were constant. The court was both justice and revenue for the Lord. Taxes were layered. Beyond manorial dues, you owed a tithe 1/10 of your produce to the parish church. It wasn't always grain. Sometimes it was honey, eggs, or a lamb. The church kept records in meticulous hand, and woe to the villager who tried to hide part of the harvest. Above these local obligations, the king might impose extraordinary taxes for wars or ransoms. These were collected in coin, which meant you had to sell something: grain, wool, or labor to obtain the currency. The wool trade, in particular, shaped the rural economy. England's fine wool was prized across Europe, especially in the cloth-making cities of Flanders. Even if you never traveled beyond your village, the sheep grazing nearby were part of a network that stretched across the channel. Lords grew wealthy from wool exports. Peasants might benefit if they could sell surplus fleece. But sheep also meant enclosure common land turned into pasture for the Lord's flocks. Pushing villagers to the margins, daily survival wasn't only about labor, it was about timing. Agriculture in the Middle Ages was a dance with the seasons. Spring brought plowing and sowing barley, oats, and peas. Summer demanded haymaking for winter fodder. Autumn was the grain harvest, an all-hands effort that could last weeks. Winter was quieter but not idle. There was threshing, winnowing, mending tools, and carting manure to the fields in readiness for spring. Weather could undo everything. A wet summer might rot the grain before it was cut. A harsh winter might kill livestock. Famine didn't appear suddenly. It crept in through failed harvests, high prices, and the exhaustion of reserves. In bad years, people resorted to eating. Acorns, weeds, and bread made from ground-up pea pods or bean husks filling. But barely nourishing, food preservation was a necessity, not a luxury. Salting meat required expensive salt, often brought from distant salt pans or coastal towns. Drying beans, peas, and fish was more common. Smoking was useful, but it required a steady fire and a dry space. Dairy products, milk, butter, cheese were consumed quickly before they spoiled. In summer, milk might turn sour in a single day. Even in ordinary years, hunger was a companion. Modern appetites are conditioned by abundance, but a medieval diet was dominated by bread and pottage. Bread varied with the seasons. In good years, wheat bread for those who could afford it. In poorer years, rye or barley bread, darker and denser. In the very worst times, bread might be stretched with ground-up tree bark, a sign of desperation. Work was gendered but overlapping. Men handled heavy plowing, hedge laying, and wood cutting. Women tended gardens, milked cows, brewed ale, and spun wool. Both genders sowed, weeded, and harvested. Children worked too, scaring birds from fields, carrying water, collecting firewood. There was no clear line between work and life. They were the same thing. Religion ran through it all like a thread. The church calendar, with its feast days and saints' festivals, punctuated the year. On holy days, you might rest from work, attend Mass, and join in processions. Lent was a season of fasting from meat, though fish and dairy might still be allowed. The pace of prayer morning, noon, evening was as regular as the tolling of the church bell. Yet faith was not only a matter of ritual, it was security in a precarious world. A bad harvest might be explained as God's punishment. Survival might be attributed to divine mercy. Saints' relics, church processions to bless the fields, and prayers for rain or sun were part of practical agriculture as much as of devotion. You lived in a world where the supernatural and the material were not separate. Illness might come from bad air, from God's will, or from witchcraft. Remedies mixed prayer with herbs. You might hang charms in your home, even while attending church every Sunday. The physical structure of the village reinforced the interdependence of its people. Houses stood close together, clustered along a main path. The fields stretched out in open strips, each family's holdings scattered to ensure fairness in soil quality. Meadows for hay lay beyond, and pastureland farther still. The commons, woodland, heath, or marsh were essential for grazing pigs, gathering firewood, and cutting turf. Without access to these, survival was difficult. All of this was regulated, not by distant kings, but by the customs of the village, enforced by the Lord's steward and remembered by elders. You knew your place not only in space, but in time. Your rights, your duties, and even your meals were predictable, and yet change did come. In 1348, the Black Death swept through England, killing perhaps a third to half the population. In its aftermath, labor was in short supply, and surviving peasants sometimes demanded higher wages or better terms. Some lords conceded. Others clamped down, leading to tensions that would boil over decades later in uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But here, in the mid-14th century, the wounds of the plague were still fresh. Many villages had empty houses. Fields lay fallow because there were not enough hands to work them. The rhythm of life persisted, but it was marked by absence. You might find yourself in a slightly better position if you survived the demand. For labor meant more bargaining power. But bargaining only went so far. The Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and punish those who refused to work for them. It was a reminder that even catastrophe could not loosen the web entirely. The medieval village, then, was not simply a backdrop, it was a machine, every person a cog. Step out of place, and the machine faltered. Fail to meet your duties, and you risked fines, hunger, or exile. It was a life both constrained and sustained by its systems. And if you woke tomorrow in that same straw bed, with the same obligations waiting, could you adapt to the constancy, the lack of choice, and the knowledge that your world might never expand beyond the next village over? Chapter 3. Beyond the village and the edges of survival. Most days in the medieval world looked the same. The fields, the livestock, the church bells, all part of an unchanging cycle. But every so often, the rhythm shifted. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And those shifts revealed both the fragility and resilience of medieval life. One such break from the routine was the market. Markets were not daily affairs. They might be held once a week in a nearby town, or even just a few times a year at a fair. For most villagers, the market meant early rising. bundling goods into baskets or onto a cart, and walking miles along rutted tracks. A good road was simply one that wasn't flooded or blocked by fallen trees. When you arrived, the market was an explosion of noise and smells compared to the quiet of the village. Stalls offered salt, iron tools, bolts of cloth, and sometimes luxuries like spices. But the market wasn't just for buying, it was for selling. Eggs, wool, chickens, honey, or surplus grain could be traded for goods you couldn't make yourself. For some, it was the only contact with outsiders all season, but markets were also places of regulation. Prices might be fixed by the town authorities. Weights and measures were inspected, and cheating could mean fines or public shaming. Bread, for example, was sold according to the assize of bread and ale, a law that tied loaf size to the price of grain. In times of scarcity, the loaf shrank rather than the price rising. Then there were fairs, rarer and more festive. Chartered by royal authority, they could last several days, attracting merchants from far afield. Cloth from Flanders, wine from France, and even silk from the Mediterranean might appear here. For a villager, a fair was as much spectacle as commerce. Musicians playing in the streets, jugglers drawing crowds, and the smell of roasted meat wafting over the tents. But these gatherings also carried risks. Crowds meant disease could spread easily. Thieves took advantage of the press of people. Prices could be unpredictable, and it was easy to spend your earnings on trinkets rather than necessities. Still, the draw of the fair was strong, a chance to glimpse a wider world. Beyond markets and fairs, travel was rare but not unheard of. Pilgrimage was one reason to leave the village. You might set out for the shrine of a saint, seeking healing, penance, or divine favor. The journey could last days or weeks, and you'd join a stream of other pilgrims, identifiable by their badges and staffs. Inns existed along major routes, but many travelers slept in barns or under the open sky. For others, travel came through obligation, a summons to court, military service for the Lord, or even conscription into the king's army could take you far from home. War might mean fighting in Scotland or France, places that, to the average villager, were more concept than reality. Even without travel, the wider world intruded. Royal messengers might pass through, carrying decrees. Tax collectors might arrive with orders from the king. Rumors of battles, plagues, or strange weather in distant lands filtered in through merchants and friars. These were fragments of a vast network of events, but most people only saw their local effects: a higher tax, a missing neighbor, a sudden shortage of goods. Law, too, had its reach. Beyond the manorial court, there were county courts and royal justices, though their appearance in a small village was rare. Crimes ranged from theft and assault to more curious medieval offenses: poaching on the Lord's land, cutting down trees without permission, or even baking substandard bread. Punishments could be fines, public humiliation in the stocks, or for severe crimes, execution. Despite the rules, conflict between neighbors was inevitable. Disputes over land boundaries, grazing rights, or water use were common. Sometimes they were settled with witness testimony in the manorial court. Other times, they simmered into grudges lasting years. In small communities, such grudges could shape alliances and tensions for generations. And then there were the disasters, rare but devastating. Fire was one of the greatest dangers. Thatched roofs and timber frames burned easily, and a single spark could wipe out half a village. There were no organized fire brigades. Everyone rushed to form a bucket line from the well, hoping to save what they could. Floods could sweep away fields. Storms could level buildings. In 1315 to 1317, a period known as the Great Famine struck much of Europe after years of heavy rains destroyed crops. People ate their seed grain, slaughtered their breeding animals, and still starved. Chroniclers reported desperate measures, rumors, perhaps exaggerated, of cannibalism. The famine left scars for decades. Even in quieter times, survival meant constant calculation. You had to judge when to slaughter animals, when to sell surplus, when to store food. Misjudging could mean hunger before winter's end. There were no safety nets beyond family, neighbors, and the church's occasional charity. Despite the hardships, people found moments of community and joy. Feasts on holy days might include music, dancing, and games. Weddings were celebrated with ale, singing, and sometimes entire animals roasted for the guests. The harvest itself, once safely gathered, was often marked with a communal meal and a sense of relief. And here lies a truth about the medieval world. Its very slowness, its lack of constant novelty, gave weight to the rare events, the fair, the feast, the pilgrimage. In a life defined by repetition, these were the markers that gave shape to memory. If you were to live here, not just visit for a day, but truly remain, you might adapt to the labor, the hunger, even the cold. Humans are resilient, but the question is not whether you could endure the hardship. The question is whether you could accept the smallness of the world, the unchanging horizon, and the knowledge that most of what you did each day had been done exactly the same way for generations, and would be done the same way long after you were gone. And that brings us to the end of today's quiet journey through history. If you found yourself drifting into that calm, slow place between curiosity and sleep, I'm glad you were here. At Quiet Boring Sleep, I make these slow stories so you can relax, unwind, and let your mind wander through the past. If you'd like to join me for more, you can like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next quiet tale. Until then, rest well and sleep deeply. Good night.